Hello and welcome to a pretty unexpected special episode from the Honest Football Podcast. We've had a couple of topical ones recently, but we probably would say this one's the most out of the blue because around lunchtime today, Charlie, you sent us an article to say that Wigan Athletic have gone into administration. And the last thing we saw of Wigan was them getting a brilliant victory last night and not expecting anything of the sort. So, I mean, how on earth? I mean, plenty of clubs have gone into administration. But before we get on to Wigan specifically, this has got to be the most out of the blue announcement of that sort you've ever seen.
Well, yeah, to be honest, I've got people fit in the kitchen. I was sort of talking to them and then I was just scrolling through my phone and then that came up. And I think what's surprising the most was, like you say, is they've recently had a takeover and it looked like, that of all the clubs who were maybe in the, say, the bottom half of the championship, there was others who I would have thought would expected that news to come from, because Wigan, been doing it on the pitch, really, haven't they? Great string of results recently. And then, as I say, it looked like maybe having an investment, was it even less than a month ago? I think I can't remember the exact date, and then to hear this is very worrying at the same point if a club like that's going into administration for maybe other clubs as well.
I mean, that's what I was going to ask you before we went on to Wigan itself. Is we talked plenty of times when doing the national leagues and the non-league and the League 1 and 2 episodes about would all clubs be able to survive this? I didn't expect the first administration to be a championship club. I don't know about you.
No, not one that's had that sort of, not pedigree, but do you know what I mean? They've been up there. It's not like a club, for example, Wickham. And what I mean by that is, never really been in the top two tiers of football, that kind of thing. This is an established football team.
Well, they won the FA Cup 6 years ago.
Exactly, and that's exactly it. So it's. Yeah, I've got to be honest. It was excuse the pun, but it was a bolt out of the blue, really, wasn't it? In that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, I'm going to go back to something you mentioned about the ownership, because obviously they've been under Dave Whelan and then his grandson for a long time, and it changed hands in 2018 towards the end of the year to a Hong Kong-based International Entertainment Corporation, and then it changed, as you mentioned, again in May this year to another Hong Kong-based consortium group, and at that point you think we've been taken over. What you don't think at that point is we're going to be administration in 6 weeks. I'll ask you about the EFL Directors Test in a minute. We'll get to that. But how on earth can you feel if you're a Wigan fan and it's happened within 5 or 6 weeks of a takeover being ratified?
Well, the thing is, for me as well, is I think that the only way I would look at it possibly is if you had a lot of foresight, you would maybe say, if the new businessmen are already selling again, they must have noticed something that hadn't maybe been declared when they bought the club in the first place, whatever that is. But I still wouldn't have anticipated it to have been that quick. You hear about changes in clubs, whether it be Blackburn or whatever, where the owners aren't necessarily well thought of. But it's a slow, gradual process that they maybe grind down the supporters' will. And do you know what I mean? Even Bury, to a point, that was a much slower process than this in terms of Steve Dale buying the club. And then, obviously, it going into, unfortunately, where it is now. But this is such a rapid turnaround. I'd be incredibly surprised if there's any Wigan fan, who could have foreseen this coming, because it's the last thing you'd expect when you get a takeover. And I mean it in the politest way possible. When you have a consortium of people, it's not like one man whose business might just go bang. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. We'll never know the full ins and outs of what went on in deals, but something must have gone amiss somewhere when they bought the club. They wouldn't. I can't imagine any businessman would have bought a club like Wigan, and then with knowing that in 2 months' time, less than it'd go under. It's surprising.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about it being after the coronavirus pandemic and things like that. But as you say, the takeover was in May. You would have known what the consequences were going to be at that point. So I don't want to gloss on that too much. But you mentioned something which was Bury, and that was my next question on the list for you. We had that awful situation on, was it the end of August last year with Bury and Bolton, where they were waiting. They were doing that awful deadline day. Are they going to be saved or not? And the first thing that was talked about after that is there has to be changes to the owner and directors tests. Now, for those who don't know, the Premier League and the EFL manage their own ones, and then the FA managed them for anywhere below the National League and in the women's game. So the EFL have done owners and directors tests on this group in May of this year, ratified this group to take over the ownership of Wigan Athletic, and 6 weeks later they're in administration. That test can't be fit for purpose. It can't be.
The thing is, though, what I don't understand is how they keep doing it. And what I mean by that is, I think it's misquoted as Einstein said. I don't think he did, but someone said, madness is doing the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome. And it seems like by the, however many umpteenth time now, this test has not weeded out a potentially dangerous business. Not business, I shouldn't say dangerous, but do you know what I mean? Harmful to the club. And yet it happens again. And it's still that same approach. And I guarantee you, even now, not that we are, but if me and you were to buy a club, we would be under the same test that those lads have had. I don't think they're going to change it anytime soon. And it's baffling all the time that you've got clubs going under or virtually, falling down the leagues because of it. I just don't understand it.
I mean, you're spot on. It's something, to be fair, it's something Craig mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, who obviously isn't here today, but he mentioned about the amount of time decisions took. And that Bury situation in Bolton was August, September last year, and we've got to June the following year, what would have been the end of the season, and those changes to those tests haven't been made, haven't been announced. And as you say, that owner who's coming at Wigan has been tested in the same way as those people, which clearly wasn't fit for purpose then.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I want to go back even before Bury, and you'd know a lot better than me as a Luton fan. Really, after the mess that, the Luton, that whole time of there's 2 or 3 clubs that were on the verge, weren't they?
Yeah.
After that, you thought lessons would have been learned, and that was how many years ago now, and we're still a whole generation, and we're still getting the same tripping over of the same mistakes and the same errors happening, and it's baffling, really. Yeah,
I mean, as I say, I'm not going to claim to be a connoisseur on the Wigan situation, but as a Luton fan growing up, I know plenty of the harms of administration. I mean, Tony Thorpe talked about it when he was on here as a player involved in it, and as you say, that season, Luton were on -30, Rotherham and Bournemouth -17. And 12 years later, we've got clubs going busts and championship clubs going in administration still, which is a disaster. But I'm not going to ask you to make any further comment on the EFL Directors Test. I'm simply going to read the opening 3 lines from the EFL website regarding this clause in their contract, whatever you want to call it. The Owners and Directors Test, intention behind this test is to protect the image and integrity of the league and its competitions, the well-being of clubs and the interests of all stakeholders in those clubs, by preventing anyone who is subject to a disqualifying condition being involved or influencing the management or administration of a club. So I'm not going to ask us to comment any further on that. I'm just going to say, make your own judgments, people, based on that one. But I suppose we better talk about Wigan itself. So the 3 men administrators who have been put in charge at the moment are Paul Stanley, Gerald Krasner and Dean Watson. And they've said the main priority is to get them through to the end of the season, fulfilling the fixtures and finding a long-term solution. So we'll talk about a couple of the men who have talked about that in the media already. But I know one of the things we've got to talk about is points deductions.
Yeah.
Because obviously, as a Luton fan, I should be delighted that we're going to get deducted 12 points. But I can't see past how on earth is this still happening. And as a Luton fan, we've been there. We've got the sympathy for that. But 12 points will be deducted this season if they aren't relegated by natural causes, which isn't going to happen because they're on 50 points. So they're going to be deducted 12 points this season.
Yeah.
So how on earth as a squad do you prepare yourself when you know that 12 points is going to be deducted off whatever you get? Because realistically, every other team's flying at the bottom near enough. How do you get the team motivated for that? Because they were doing a brilliant job before then, Paul Cook.
Well, that's what I mean, and that's what I think you've touched on something really important there, that obviously up to yesterday, or sorry, today even, they were flying, weren't they? And maybe the motivation was, I mean, they pushed themselves up, what is it, 14th now? 13th, 14th they're on the league?
Points. There wasn't even a sign of it last night after they battered Stoke.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and yet I guarantee you, if that game yesterday, when we're recording, had been played tomorrow, completely different result. I would argue probably a Stoke win, because you got nothing. They're dead rubbers, aren't they? I mean, I know they're 4 points off. They're never going to have a 13-point gap because it's so tight down the bottom, and they're all playing each other. Yeah. They're never going to get a 13-point gap. So they were damned if they do either way, weren't they? So for me, I think as a manager and a player, I don't know what your motivation is. I think it must be an incredibly... I mean, I suppose anyone who played for Luton at the time would argue the same thing when you spoke to Tony Thorpe about it, but I can't see what your motivation is going to be. I suppose the only thing might be, from a player's perspective, is you're looking, right, I need to get a move next season, because, if your ambition is to not be in League One, your performances... But then that's an individual approach, and that doesn't always do well when you're scrapping down the bottom of the table. So I can't see it going well for him.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that's something that I'm probably more concerned about than this season as a Wigan fan. And we've had it with Luton, you've seen it with Bolton. Having a club to support at the end is the most important thing. And we've heard that from Tony Thorpe, which is you're in a room with administrators and a manager telling them that you're worth this much. But the administrators are businessmen. They've got to do what they can to keep the club afloat. And if they get an offer for a player, they accept it if it's going to keep the club afloat. And if we get to that stage in the summer or after the season where an owner hasn't been found, you've got to worry about how much of that squad is going to be torn apart, surely.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. I think Paul Cook's done such a good job building that together. Yeah. I know that they were near the bottom and they put a little run together, but given the last few seasons after the FA Cup win, it's not really gone swimmingly. No. I think then he's done such a good job there, and to see that basically decimated by financial mismanagement or whatever, of people who maybe you could argue haven't got the club's interests at heart, it must be so demoralising as a manager. It really must. And I suppose you haven't even got in maybe the same way Luton did, where even when they're in that situation and still had thousands of people turn up to games, they still had a good away support. You haven't even got that if you're a player for Wigan, because obviously because of the empty stadiums, you can't even use that as a bit of a motivator, you know, the crowd getting behind you in a backs to the wall sort of situation. So it's pretty bad, I've got to be honest.
Well, that's the sort of thing, isn't it? I know probably Wigan have got a fairly similar standard fan base to Luton, but obviously, as you say, it's in a 25,000 seater stadium, which we've already talked about the bill paying of that. It was sold off a couple of years ago. But also, when you've got 8,000 people making an atmosphere at Kenilworth Road, it's hostile. When you've got 8,000 people still turning up, still a brilliant support at Wigan Stadium, that's going to make a huge difference, because it's just going to be an empty space. I mean, the atmosphere wasn't great there before the lockdown, but now that's going to be really tough to motivate yourself to play in.
But the thing is, what I worry about, and I don't want to be all doomsday, but what would worry me a little bit as a Wigan fan is that stadium and all of that is a very marketable. Obviously, the rugby league team use it as well. Yep. It's a sellable sort of thing, and you'd hate for that to start happening when you start looking, right, we're going to have to look for a new home, because you end up like Coventry then, that kind of situation. And if that's where they're going to get to, I hope it isn't. But
that's the biggest thing, isn't it? Once you don't own the stadium anymore, you can be kicked out, which is a luxury most clubs don't have, unfortunately. Now, as you mentioned, Coventry in particular, you've seen the problems that can cause. But I've got to ask you one final bit for Wigan. We need to try and offer some hope at the end without being connoisseurs. So I've seen, even in the 2 hours since it's been announced, I've seen Dave Whelan on TV and radio saying he'll try and find a way to save the club. And obviously, it's a club that won the FA Cup 6 years ago. They've got good facilities off the pitch, even aside from the ground. Surely there's going to be interest. But the problem in these situations, like when Steve Dale took over at Bury, is you then get often the wrong owner, because it's desperation. Can we get someone? Not necessarily the right person.
Exactly. And I think that's a great point. You end up either then, you know, going one way. I think this is such crossroads. I know it's an obvious thing to say, but genuinely, the next person coming in is so pivotal, because it could essentially run the club into the ground and end up with someone like Steve Dale, because they're just going to sell it. And as we know, the fit and proper persons test still isn't fit and proper. Or you have someone like Dave Whelan. But even if Dave Whelan comes in, and I'm sure he'd do a magnificent job, you've essentially undone the last couple of years of getting promoted, all of the effort and time and sweat and blood and money that went into that, to just basically float around and just try and keep an existence, which it's okay, but it's not what you'd have bargained for as a Wigan fan when you got promoted last year. Do you know what I mean? It's just not what you'd have thought about. It wouldn't have crossed your mind. And I think to just have an existence, okay, you've got to be grateful for that, but you also can't just use that as something that you should aspire to. A club like Wigan, for example, especially, shouldn't be aspiring to just be existing.
Well, but then we've said this about Bolton, and it's happened, hasn't it? So it's not ruled out. But as you mentioned, the club was finally on its way up. Paul Cook took them up, kept them up, and looked like he was going to do so again this year. And it looks like it's been torn away. But there is hope for Wigan fans, in the sense that as long as you've got a club to support at the end, I can tell you as a Luton fan, that's the most important bit. There's not really many consoling or kind words I can offer. All I can say as a Luton fan is that I hope that that's not what cost them relegation, but it looks likely it is going to be, isn't it? So what's your final prediction for how this will pan out?
Well, actually, I'm probably going against something that we've already mentioned. I honestly think now the only thing that might keep them up is the fact of players wanting to play for a contract elsewhere, but they're still going to get deducted the points. What might happen now is they slowly drop into the relegation zone, and I think this is slightly more dangerous, is then they start League One with 12-point deduction, which then makes it even harder. So as a Wigan fan, player or manager, my motivation would be, actually, although we're going to get relegated this year, the more we can get ahead now, if we can stay at that relegation zone, it makes next season a little bit easier, gives us a bit more of a fighting chance next year. I think what you want to avoid is going into League One with -12, because then that's a bit of a mountain to climb. So
I'm going to go very bold here, and you're probably going to be quite surprised by this, because Wigan, obviously, 10 points clear at the moment. There's 8 points clear at the moment, the relegation zone, 10 clear of Luton, and probably on the best form they've been in all season. I reckon they're going to get more than a 12-point gap and survive this year. However, that doesn't solve the problem, as we've seen with other clubs before. I mean, Bury's happened after a promotion, so there's no point getting too excited about that. The only thing I can hope for is that either a Dave Whelan comes back, or they get a proper owner who just wants to run the club. It doesn't matter where they're from, but they want a sustainable club. And hopefully Wigan can build, and the fans have got a club to support next year. We've had a few down in the comments recently, so all I can say is let us know what you think, but it must be even more shocking if you're a Wigan fan.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's such a sad day for football in that, when you hear clubs like any club going, particularly one like Wigan. I think that touches the nerve a bit more, I think, almost.
Yeah, a very strange bit of news and a very shocking time for it. But obviously, we wish Wigan the best. As a Luton fan, I won't take any joy in us finishing above them because of points differences, because we've been there too many times to say that. But hopefully, things will work out well for them. If you did enjoy this episode, I know it's probably quite hard to, please put a thumbs up on the video. Let us know what you think, particularly if you're a Wigan fan. How surprising was it to you? Because it certainly caught us off guard, and there was no sign of it from Paul Cook yesterday in his post-match press conference. So it's a really bizarre one. If you haven't already, subscribe down below. We've got loads of content on the channel, interviews with current and former pros, match day vlogs when we're allowed to return again, and topical podcasts and championship predictions, which the next episode will be tomorrow. Hopefully a slightly more cheery one from us. But thank you very much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you next time.